On the final days of 2006, a quiet financial transaction passed, almost unnoticed. The British government transferred roughly $83 million to the United States Treasury. There were no ceremonies, no speeches, no headlines. Yet this payment closed a financial account that had been open since the aftermath of World War II. More than 6 decades after victory celebrations echoed through London, Britain had finally finished paying for the war. Not the war it fought, but the war it survived. 3 generations of taxpayers had carried this obligation. And while history books often describe this debt as repayment for generosity, the reality is far more complex. The money was not charged for defeating Nazi Germany. It was charged for permission to remain in the fight. The interest payments were merely the visible portion of a far larger transfer that reshaped the global balance of power. Between the early years of the war and its conclusion, the United States oversaw the largest nonviolent transfer of wealth ever recorded. Britain entered the conflict as the dominant financial power on Earth. It emerged exhausted, indebted, and permanently diminished. Gold reserves vanished. Overseas investments were liquidated. Strategic territories were leased away, and financial sovereignty was surrendered piece by piece. What collapsed was not only Britain's balance sheet, but the foundation of its empire. This outcome was not accidental, nor was it driven by charity. It was managed, negotiated, and enforced through contracts, conditions, and financial leverage, while Britain faced an existential threat. Understanding how this happened is not about rewriting World War II. It is about understanding how modern power operates when nations are desperate and allies hold leverage. By the winter of 1940, Britain stood alone. Much of Europe had fallen. German submarines hunted supply ships across the Atlantic. British cities were under constant bombardment. Every aircraft, every tank, every ton of fuel mattered. But beneath the military crisis lay a financial collapse. Britain had exhausted its liquid resources. The empire that once financed half the world could no longer pay its bills. Before the war, Britain's wealth was immense. Its currency anchored global trade. Its investments spanned continents. Railways, mines, plantations, shipping lines, and oil concessions generated steady income that sustained the imperial system. London was the nerve center of global finance. Gold reserves backed the pound. That position unraveled with astonishing speed once the war began. American neutrality laws allowed Britain to buy supplies, but only under strict conditions. Everything had to be paid for up front, in cash, and transported using British shipping. No credit, no delay. The rule appeared neutral, but it had devastating consequences. Britain had no alternative suppliers. American industry was the only source capable of meeting wartime demand. Payment flowed one way, relentlessly. Within months, Britain shipped its gold across submarine-infested waters. Priceless reserves were moved to North America simply to keep contracts alive. By the end of 1940, those reserves were gone. What remained were long-term investment assets built over generations, which could only be sold at enormous loss. When British officials admitted they could no longer pay, the problem shifted from military to financial negotiation. The popular narrative describes American leadership stepping in with selfless assistance. In reality, aid was conditional upon total financial disclosure and asset liquidation. Britain was required to demonstrate absolute insolvency before assistance would be considered. American officials demanded inventories of overseas holdings, corporate ownership, and private investments. British negotiators warned that selling productive assets during wartime would cripple the country's future. They argued that liquidation under pressure would guarantee losses and leave Britain impoverished once peace returned. These objections were acknowledged and dismissed. The logic was blunt. If Britain still owned valuable assets, then American taxpayers should not subsidize the war. Everything saleable had to go first. Only after liquidation would assistance flow. Major British-owned companies operating in the United States were forced onto the market under duress. Buyers understood the circumstances. Prices reflected desperation, not value. Proceeds were routed directly to cover existing supply contracts. What looked like commerce was effectively foreclosure. This process extended far beyond a handful of companies. Entire portfolios of securities were unwound. Decades of accumulated investment income disappeared into American markets at discounted prices. The transfer enriched financial institutions and corporate buyers, while permanently hollowing out Britain's overseas income. At the same time, strategic concessions followed. Military bases across the Atlantic world were leased for nearly a century in exchange for outdated naval equipment. The geographic foundation of American global reach was laid not through conquest, but negotiation conducted under extreme pressure. When formal aid legislation was eventually approved, It was presented as a loan of equipment rather than money. The language was deliberately reassuring. Tools would be returned later. Costs would be settled afterward. Yet embedded within the agreements were clauses that reached far beyond wartime necessity. Britain was required to dismantle its system of imperial trade preference once the war ended. This system had bound the empire together economically, ensuring captive markets for British industry. Removing it meant opening those markets to global competition. Competition Britain, weakened and indebted, could not win. The war years accelerated this imbalance. American industry expanded at unprecedented speed, supplying not only weapons but civilian goods for global markets. British industry, focused entirely on war production, abandoned export markets it would never regain. By the time peace approached, commercial dominance had already shifted across the Atlantic. When fighting ended, Britain expected relief. Instead, assistance stopped almost immediately. Supply lines were cut without transition. Ships turned back. The economy, still structured for total war, was thrown into crisis. Food imports, fuel supplies, and industrial inputs were suddenly unaffordable. Britain faced a stark choice: secure emergency financing or accept economic collapse. Negotiations followed, but they were no longer conducted between equals. The proposed solution was a loan large enough to prevent immediate disaster, but structured to eliminate what remained of British financial autonomy. One condition proved catastrophic: the pound was required to become freely convertible into dollars. This meant that accumulated wartime balances held across the empire could be exchanged immediately. Predictably, they were. Within weeks, Britain lost enormous reserves as holders rushed toward the stronger currency. The experiment collapsed almost instantly, but the damage was done. Reserves vanished. Confidence evaporated. Britain was forced to retreat from international commitments it had upheld for generations. Strategic responsibilities passed to the United States. The global order quietly reorganized itself. Over the following decades, Britain adjusted, rebuilt, and stabilized, but never reclaimed its former position. The debt remained. Payments continued year after year, long after the war faded from living memory. Only in the 21st century was the final installment transferred. Meanwhile, the beneficiaries were clear. American industry expanded permanently. Financial institutions consolidated influence. The dollar replaced the pound at the center of global finance. Military infrastructure built during the crisis became permanent. A new empire emerged without formal conquest. This pattern did not end with Britain. Variations of it appeared repeatedly during the Cold War and beyond. Aid flowed during crises. Conditions followed. Markets opened. Bases were established. Debt ensured alignment. Prosperity came, but independence narrowed. This is not a story of villains or heroes. It is a case study in how power functions when survival is at stake. When nations are desperate, leverage replaces ideals. Agreements signed under pressure shaped decades. Britain survived the war. It helped defeat a brutal enemy. But survival came at a price that extended far beyond the battlefield. The empire was not lost in combat. It was dismantled through contracts, balance sheets, and clauses few civilians ever read. Understanding this history is not about resentment. It is about clarity. Modern alliances are built on finance as much as shared values. And when crises arrive, the true structure of power reveals itself not through speeches, but through terms. Britain won the war. America won the century.